Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the show. Well, what a week. The Sue Gray report finally landed after much anticipation. What did it tell us? I mean, in a sense, we already knew quite a lot of what was in the report, but I think it's worth underlining some of it. When the country was subject to severe lockdown rules because of a deadly pandemic, which has killed up to 170,000 of our fellow citizens, lockdown rules, which it should be said, banned handshakes, let alone hugs. Number 10 officials drank beer and Prosecco until they vomited, spilled wine down walls, broke a child's swing, organised events cutely named Wine Time Friday and Wine and Cheese Evening alongside a secret Santa. Lovely. Entertained themselves with a karaoke machine, which I'm not joking, was provided by the former Director General for Propriety and Ethics, and partied until after 4 a.m. Now, in terms of did they know what was right or wrong, they did. But what they spoke about in these messages revealed in the Sue Gray report was what was deemed a comms risk. In the words of Boris Johnson's private secretary, Martin Reynolds, he boasted they seemed to have got away with their illicit drinks. Now, I have to say myself, I think the most damning part of the report from my own perspective was that Sue Gray detailed a lack of respect and poor treatment of security and cleaning staff. Now, I raise this because it's something that's always been impressed upon me. It's kind of an odd thing. I think it's a fair comment to say this. So you normally can't judge people based on a first impression. I mean, that's what people often say. Someone might be having a bad day, something terrible might have happened to them. There is one very clear exception to this when you can just judge a person's character immediately, which is if they are nice to you, but they are not nice to the waiter, they're not a nice person. And the reason for that is someone who is not in a position of power and authority, who can't speak back and has very limited redress, being spoken to in a way which is abusive, haranguing, bullying, that tells you all you need to know about that person. Now, the fact that number 10 officials, many of them have spoken to underpaid, undervalued staff in a contemptuous way, which has been highlighted by an official report, I think speaks volumes about the character of some of the people working in number 10. Now, I actually attended a protest outside number 10 on Friday, organised by trade union United Voices of the World, which has unionised some of the cleaners and other staff, underpaid staff who work in government buildings. I just want to show just quickly a little clip of one of the cleaners speaking outside number 10.
We are here today to say rules are one, rules are all. No matter what cabinet you sit into, you are not above the law of this land or any land where you're from. So we want support for the cleaners who want higher wages because we work hard enough and they look down on us like we are the dirt that we clean, consuming human pollution wherever we work because we want an honest pay, so we should get it as we deserve to have it. Thank you, guys.
Now, George Osborne, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, tweeted out in response to the Sue Gray report, that passage. One of the things I remember most about living in Downing Street was how amazingly friendly, generous and kind the team who keep the place going are. The cleaners, custodians, front of house and police, working all hours, not very well paid, but always there for us. Oh, that's sweet, isn't it? Just out of interest, George Osborne, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, do you know anyone who might have maybe had a say in how well these, what you described as not very well paid staff who you have showered with praise because of how well they did their job? Any idea who could increase their pay at the time? Honestly. Anyway, we've got lots to talk about today. We're very lucky about to introduce a brilliant guest, very well connected, knows the lay of the land in the Tory party in a way that, I'll be honest with you, I'm not an absolute expert. I don't, as you, not to surprise anyone, don't spend many an evening chatting to Tory ministers on phones, for example. They won't return my calls. So it's great to be able to speak to someone who knows the Conservative Party very well. But also I'm interested, we'll talk about, he's got a paperback version of his book coming out, which I will also talk about, which looks at the new, I suppose, Tory voter coalition built in former Labour constituencies. But we've got lots to talk about. The Sue Gray report, of course, latest revelations in the Sunday papers about another party, yet another party, not another one, as Brenda from Bristol would put it. And just, I'm interested, obviously, what the title says. Is Boris Johnson going to resign? No, I mean, it's kind of embarrassing if anyone's going to look past some of the previous videos and podcasts we've done, which is kind of along the lines of Boris Johnson must be doomed now. It's all over for Boris Johnson. It wasn't, as you can probably tell. He's still Prime Minister despite everything. His political death has been predicted over and over again, and yet there he is, still Prime Minister of the country. So is he going to lead the Tories into the next election? I think that's obviously still an interesting question. He has defied political gravity over and over again, and other politicians would have fallen long ago for just one of the many things that Boris Johnson has been found guilty of. But there we have it. Right. So if you're joining us live, do click on the YouTube link if you can. It's just nice if you watch it on YouTube. Press like and subscribe, and do leave comments. Keep them. You can be punchy. You can ridicule my appearance to a degree, but obviously try and be nice if you can, at least to each other. Otherwise, you'll get barred by the moderator. But do join the discussion and do subscribe. Right, let's bring in Sebastian Payne, who's who I was talking about, either way, from the Financial Times, who, for those listening on the podcast, he's got a lovely big greenery behind him. It's nice to have a bit of flora. Normally people, as you can see, I look like I could just be like in a prison cell. But Sebastian is, or Seb, I don't want to keep calling you Sebastian. You are Seb.
You can go for Seb. That's fine. It's a Sunday afternoon.
Exactly. Nice and relaxed Sunday afternoon. How are you, Seb, firstly?
I'm very well, thanks. I'm very well. It's a lovely day here. We've got some sunshine and papers have been fun today. Lots and lots of political stuff to get stuck into.
There certainly is. Where should we begin? I think we'll start. Let's have a look. I think we'll start with. So the Sunday Times has this piece about the headline is muzzled ? How senior officials fought to water down Sue Gray report. With a dogged refusal to accept the blame and little luck, Boris Johnson succeeded in neutering Sue Gray's verdict on the number 10 parties. Now, as Adam Bienkov, he's a very good political journalist, says, the Times reports that Downing Street had access to drafts of Sue Gray's report in advance and intervened to get details of the ABBA party in Boris Johnson's flat removed. There's been a lot of talk about this so-called ABBA party, in that many people think this is probably like the most egregious example. This was after Dominic Cummings went, wasn't it? And they celebrated allegedly.
That's right. This November 2020.
That's right. Good to have the date specific. So, what are your thoughts? What do you think? What's in this story that you think you find striking?
So the fact is, the Met Police have told us absolutely nothing about that. I mean, I think they've handled the whole thing completely atrociously, with no transparency, no clarity. We shall have no idea who was fined, why were they fined, or for what particular events. And on that particular date, which I think was the 13th of November 2020, I think there were two events. One was the leaving party for Lee Kane, Boris Johnson's director of comms, and we saw pictures of that which were leaked to ITV and were in the Sue Gray report. There's also been reports of this so-called flat party, and there's a lot of conflicting stuff about this from both sides. But some people, potentially those more aligned, I think, with the Dominic Cummings side of the view, say that there was a party to celebrate his departure that included music and all the rest of it. Other sources involved in this, because this whole thing's become a classic Westminster briefing war, say that in fact it was a work meeting and they were discussing how to deal with the fact that they just lost their director of strategy and the most important person within Downing Street. The crucial thing, though, is that the Met Police and Sue Gray have not dug into this party. Now, the thing to remember about Sue Gray, Owen, and I think this is very important, is she's not independent. She's a civil servant. She works for the Prime Minister, and he commissioned her to do the report. And I spoke to a former Tory cabinet minister who worked very closely with Sue Gray in the past. And this person said to me, Sue Gray and Cabinet Office inquiries will never do in a Prime Minister. And why? Because they don't see it as their job to do that. She's constitutionally separate to that. You know, if you wanted a proper independent inquiry into Partygate, you could have got a judge, you could have got a lord. There's the Inquiries Act, which is you set that out entirely separately. That's not what this was. This was asking someone within government to look at this. And that's why many people are frustrated, I think, by the outcome, because it could have been hampered. But it's very clear to know what this was about. So there's reports that are swirling around, I think it's in the Sunday Times today, where they talk more about this party and saying that it could be potentially investigated. And we should forget that we've gone through two Partygate investigations. So we've had the Met Police, which finished finished Operation Hillman a couple of weeks ago. We've had Sue Gray, but we've also got the Privileges Committee, which is to look about whether Boris Johnson knowingly misled the House of Commons. And that work will kick off as soon as they come back from recess the week after next. And that committee will have the potential to call witnesses, to call evidence. And that's when we'll get to the bottom of whether there was a party in the flat, the so-called ABBA party, whether it was a work meeting, and who's got it right in this kind of weird briefing war that is still going on.
Yeah, we'll come on to that into the Sanders Committee, because this is actually, in terms of the question mark about, to quote the philosopher Taylor Swift, is he out of the woods? Is he out of the woods? Can't remember the next bit. So we'll come on to that, because this saga isn't over, because I think many might think, well, the Sue Gray report, that's it. Whatever happens now, he's escaped. But obviously, there's still more to come. Yeah, this Carrie party we're talking about. So this is in the Sunday Times again. Unseen text messages hint at Carrie Johnson's second party in number 10. It's a funny bit of detail here, because Harry York at the Sunday Times, the deputy political editor of the Sunday Times, she used a very specific term to refer to the friends, according to the Sun. Sorry, what did she say? Yes, she used a very specific term to refer to the friends in the flat. She was already in a flat with at least 2 male friends. Well, Dan Hodges, actually, in his Mail on Sunday column, actually wrote about this earlier in the year. She said, "I'm with the gays up in the flat. Can you come up?" That's funny. I mean, that is very funny. What
your text must have got missed in the post, Owen, when that went out.
No, what? Come on, Carrie. Yeah, didn't get invited. That we know of. In terms of this is quite interesting though, because Dominic Cummings has always gone on about this, hasn't he? I mean, he's got an interest in it, because that's when he left and he had a big tussle with Carrie Johnson. There was a big power struggle with, obviously, Carrie Johnson, who has an advantage because she is the partner of the Prime Minister. He lost. He's aware of this party to celebrate his political demise, so he's zoned in on it. So, but this is what's interesting, isn't it? Because it is seemingly the most egregious example, and yet the Met hasn't, and Sue Gray didn't investigate it as a consequence. So,
if it was, if you take the Mr. Cummings's view of this party and what his people have briefed out, as you said, that would be a very egregious breach, because it was in the private residence of the Prime Minister. I mean, if you're playing ABBA to you and me, that's certainly a party. Everyone loved going to an ABBA party. So it's quite hard to justify it in that sense. What we just don't know is the facts about it, because don't forget, from the very beginning, Sue Gray was setting out a clear narrative about all this, because there's been so much briefing from sort of pro and anti Boris Johnson people. The key thing of her inquiry was to say, okay, this is what happened at what time, backed up by photos and by witness statements, and her 37-page report does that. But with regards to that, she didn't investigate, and the Met didn't, as far as we know, really investigate that either. So if we're going to find out exactly, was there ABBA, was there a party, or was it, as I guess the other side of it is, which is just a work meeting, people talking about work, may or may not with ABBA in the background, that's where the Privileges Committee will kind of go. But you're right, that if the narrative that's out there was correct, that would obviously be pretty problematic for the PM.
You cannot work listening to SOS by ABBA. It is physically impossible.
Have you tried?
I haven't, because I know it's not a feasible scenario. It's, I mean, we've all got our favorite ABBA songs. SOS, I think, is up there with mine. You just can't do it. So let's have a look at some of the details. I'm just quite interested in some of the details before we talk about the mood of the Tory party generally. I mean, a lot of this is kind of like, people might think, well, is this that important? It's interesting. It's in the Sunday Times. So Adam Bienkov pulled this out, which is in the Sunday Times repeats, says another example of lax discipline was that the 8:30 a.m. meeting of senior staff was moved at one point to 9 a.m. because Johnson kept being late. You had people coming in from miles away to be there by 7:30 a.m., but he couldn't be bothered to walk down 2 flights of stairs to get there on time, a source said. Suddenly Boris Johnson's relatable. It is also claimed that Martin Reynolds, the former principal private secretary, left after organising a bring your own booze party, used to pretend Johnson was in meetings to cover for him while he was having an afternoon nap. It's the Prime Minister, everybody. I mean, what's your sense of kind of how Boris Johnson's work ethic as Prime Minister?
Well, I think one context is worth putting into all this at this time as well. This was when the Prime Minister and his wife, I think, had just had their first son, Wilfred, at that point. And I think people who are a bit more positive towards the PM than you would see in that particular reporting would say that, you know, you've got a young child, everyone knows what that is like. But I think it was Matt Chorley at the Times who reported quite a long time ago about the Prime Minister potentially taking afternoon naps when he was required. I think it's an interesting thing about the role of PM now, and regardless of Boris Johnson privately, is the role just sort of too big in some respects? That, you know, and obviously after this whole business, they've created the Office for Prime Minister, which is meant to try and provide a better, more formal structure around the PM. And essentially, they've split the Cabinet Office in two. Half of it's gone over to this new Office for the PM, which is all the economic, domestic policy stuff. There's a new permanent secretary of number 10, Samantha Jones, sadly not from Sex and the City, but the other Samantha Jones, known much more widely in Whitehall, to try and provide a better structure around that. And it's funny because when Boris Johnson was Mayor of London, he had a very clear structure around him, first Sir Simon Milton and then Lord Eddie Lister, who were there to try and sort of give policy heft, shall we say, and do the details. Because I think even the Prime Minister's biggest supporters would not say. He was like, you know, Theresa May, I think, used to get up at 5 a.m., do 2 hours of red boxes, then do the morning meetings, then go on with the day, and then meetings, and then do more red boxes, and then go back to it. Like, there is so much to do. It never kind of really ends. And I think when you've got a PM who's like Boris Johnson, who focuses on the bigger picture, as he would put it, the narratives, that kind of stuff, the detail is just not going to be there for him. And I think that's why they've tried to create this new structure. I mean, I somehow doubt he's actually just falling asleep on his desk within Downing Street. I feel like that would be sort of quite unrealistic. But I mean, who among us has not maybe had a heavy night, may or may not, you know, and had a bit of a nap. But yeah, it does say it is something interesting that this whole narrative has developed on people who've worked with him, who is just like, he's not putting the hours. But I don't kind of see how you couldn't, because there's just so much to do in that job in terms of the red boxes. And this is, of course, Dominic Cummings' big criticism. He's always said he wasn't judicious with the red boxes. But again, I don't know how you cannot be, because the British state doesn't function if you're not signing off security warrants, economic papers, all that kind of stuff.
What would you say the mood amongst Tory MPs is? I mean, it's not a homogenous block, obviously. There are different factions within the Tories. They're pointing in different directions. But what's the general lay of the land, do you think, with regards to...
It's really an odd one, Owen, at the moment, because, first of all, if you were just an outside person looking at it, people who sort of like follow your journalism, you'd be like, this is it. It's going to happen drip by drip. There's letters every single day. And look at the front page of The Observer, and you've got Ian Duncan Smith, who's not exactly on the left, the Tory party, saying we've got this big ideological vacuum. But then most of the people who publicly come out and put letters, they're exactly who you would expect. So like Sir Bob Neal, London MP, who's again been a long-time critic of Boris Johnson. Jeremy Hunt, as we know from the Mail on Sunday, is on manoeuvres with his people doing secret dinners at pubs in Westminster to talk about transport policy, apparently, which is, I think, one up from technology lessons. And when you look at that kind of whole picture, stuff is moving, but the critical mass is like the centre of the Tory party, which is kind of people who are pro-Brexit, quite moderate in their views. Privately, they're really fed up, like really, really fed up. But what they're not doing is moving it over the line, because their calculation at the moment still is, do you want a slightly tarnished Boris Johnson, who his allies will say to these kind of wavering MPs, look, Boris has never lost a national election. He's won London twice, the EU referendum, general election. Every other contender has never fought a national election before as a leading figure. Because all the people from the cabinet, they're all sort of out the front line. Many of them have left Parliament. So for those people, the calculation is, do you want sort of, you know, slightly tarnished Boris, or do you want someone totally untested? That's why they're not really shifting in big numbers at the moment. The key test is going to be these by-elections coming up, right? So we've got the Wakefield by-election and the Tiverton-Homerton by-election. Wakefield will almost certainly go. I mean, like, it would take a miracle for the Tories to win that. And the expectation management is well underway. And despite, you know, like the guy the Tories have chosen up that I actually interviewed in my book, Nadeem Ahmed, who is the Conservative leader of Wakefield Council. And I actually thought he was a lot more impressive than Imran Ahmed Khan, who is obviously the Tory MP who's now gone to prison for child sexual abuse. But the Labour's obviously had a bit of backwards and forwards on their selection as well, whereas the person local or what have you. So if it was being fought on like who's the best local candidate, the Tories would be in the good shot, I think. But actually, it's going to be about wider issues. It's going to be about people just being very annoyed with Boris Johnson. On Tiverton and Homerton, like the Lib Dems are throwing, 15 kitchen sinks at that by-election because it's always been a Tory safe seat, but it's a part of the world where they're traditionally very strong. So if the Tories lose both of those, plus this general unhappiness, where does that leave you? And that's when I think you could get over that crucial 54 marker, when that kind of moderate centre ground, the Tory party goes, you know what, we're fed up. There's real damage being sustained to the party right now, because at the moment, that's not quite at that crucial level. And of course, the PM's quite lucky that it's the Jubilee now. So Westminster's in recess. Everyone's off celebrating 70 years of the Queen, not thinking about politics. But as I said, when they come back from recess, it's straight back into it with those by-elections.
We're talking about, for example, the Red Wall. Well, I mean, I'll mention your book properly in a second.
Exactly.
But in fact, I'll mention it now just so we're aware. Seb has written this very, very fascinating book called Broken Heartlands, A Journey Through Labour's Lost England. The paperback version will be out on June the 23rd with a new chapter on the so-called Blue Wall, which is the kind of southern seats which the Liberal Democrats might have a kind of or are looking or angling for. It's where Labour's not really in massive, often contention. They're not always. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Red Wall, so these are the seats obviously in often smaller towns in mostly northern England, but I suppose you can include Wales. But let's talk about, that's where you focused on and where people mostly speak about. A lot of those Tory MPs, their view was, well, actually, Boris Johnson has a unique cut through with this new voter coalition in these seats. And they're not confident enough that another Tory leader, Rishi Sunak's star has exploded quite spectacularly. But Liz Truss, I suppose, is another one. They're just not confident that they can cut through. I'll come on to Jeremy Hunt. You mentioned him because I'm interested in that. But so what do you think the calculation is with them now? Do you think, because, if we look at Boris Johnson's ratings, they are very, very bad. They're actually quite spectacularly bad. It is true when Partygate fades from the headlines, they do actually go up. I mean, maybe partly the Ukraine war had something to do with that. So we'll see what happens if Partygate goes out, the new headlines for Al, if he can recover. But they are very bad. And a lot of, is it James Johnson? Is he the pollster?
That's right. Yeah. Theresa May's pollster, yeah.
Right. So he was Theresa May's pollster. And his big shtick is, look, he's really toxic now. If you do focus groups of particular, Red Wall voters, they're really angrily contemptuous towards the Prime Minister in a way that it's hard to see how he can recover. So I'm interested, what do you think those Tory MPs are thinking now? Do you think they're thinking, well, actually, he does have this unique cut through, he's a big campaigner in a way the others aren't? Or are they thinking, actually, these voters are quite angry with him now, they're not going to change their minds?
So it's a really interesting question, this. And Chris Curtis, the poster from Opinion, he's argued that actually the biggest Tory losses have been in support for the PM have actually been in the Red Wall, not in the southern sort of Blue Wall kind of places. So my view on this, I wrote about in Broken Heartlands and in articles for the FT, is that essentially these places had been structurally and economically trending away from Labour for quite some time as they've gone through deindustrialisation. Their economies have become more atomised. People's lives have become more individualistic, and those kind of bonds that brought them to the Labour movement. So whether it's, trade unions, collectivized communities, as I called them in the book, where people, live together, socialize together, work together, they've been broken down since Thatcherism, basically. And so bit by bit, those intrinsic bonds have disappeared. And when you came to the 2019 election, the combination of the Brexit question, they really wanted to get Brexit done, plus the unpopularity of Jeremy Corbyn in those seats, he was pretty unpopular in those Red Wall seats, pushed those voters over the line. But that didn't make them natural Tories. It basically meant that, okay, we're fed up with Labour, UKIP's gone, we're not interested in the Brexit Party, the Lib Dems are nowhere in these places, so we're going to give you a try. We're going to trust the Tories and see what's going to happen. And crucially, they were not trusting Theresa May's Tories or David Cameron's. They were trusting Boris Johnson's new shiny Tories, which in every way felt different to where the party was before. You know, its language was different, its policies were very different. You know, there was no talk about kind of cuts or austerity. It was spending all this money, you know, putting 20,000 police officers, which I think was exactly the amount that Conservatives cut after the 2010 election, for example. But that whole narrative was very, very different. And on the steps outside of Downing Street and the morning after the election, Boris Johnson said to those voters, "You've put your trust in me. I'm going to repay that trust." Now, the question is, by the time we get to the next election, which, by the way, there is not going to be an early election. Like, people very high up in the Tory party are planning it. You know, obviously, apart from the fact, as you mentioned, the POSO, and it would be complete madness to do it. Like, they want as much time as possible for both getting as far away from the pandemic and inflation, because if you look at likes of Andy Haldane, the head of the RSA and the Bank of England's former chief economist, he reckons inflation is not going to trend downwards until the end of 23. So again, you want to push that really as far as you can to get away from high inflation. So all that together means, in the calculation of Tory strategists, you've got from this point, really this month, 2 years until the next election. So you've got to do the best with the economy, but you've also just got to try and build lots of stuff, because that's fundamentally what the levelling up agenda was about. So for those red wall Tory MPs, you're thinking, okay, number one, we need to get building stuff. And the fact is, they just haven't done enough on that. Like, you know, and that part of that's the pandemic, but voters won't give that as an excuse to be like, you promised me better hospitals, better roads, better infrastructure. Where is it? So, and the fear among many red wall Tories is, if another leader came, particularly someone like Jeremy Hunt, who's more southern facing, he won't have an interest in building hospitals in the north, because that's not his Toryism. His Toryism is much more about cutting taxes, a smaller, efficient state, not Boris Johnson's Toryism, which is much more about bigger and spending. So their concern is the ideological direction of the party would shift, plus that point about the unique appeal. And time and time again, you know, I interviewed about 150 people and traveled 6,000 miles to the book. People would just say to me, you know, Boris, he's the guy you want to have a pint mate, you want to go to the pub with, and he's got a populist appeal in those places. And there's just no one out of any of the contenders who I think gets anywhere near that. So for those MPs, they're still thinking Boris, with his tarnished ratings, is better the alternative. And they hope, or I guess they're desperate that he can pull that back. And if he can, then they're vindicated. If he can't, they all lose their seats.
It's interesting. A poll today suggests, in terms of active Tory members, 40% want Boris Johnson to resign compared to 53% to stay.
This was the Con Home poll, wasn't it?
That's right, which is much tougher for Boris Johnson than Tory voters. Only 27% of Tory voters think he should resign. 63% thinks he could stay. Well, that's interesting. Why do you think there's such a big divergence? Why are active Tory members significantly more likely to want Boris Johnson to resign? I mean, it's not level, but there's 40% is a lot.
It is, and it's also because they do these polls every month, and it's a significant mark upwards since the Sue Gray report came out in that latest polling you mentioned. So the events of this week, you know, many members of the public are far more concerned about trying to fill their cars and buy food than what's going on in Westminster. But for Tory party members, I think this does matter to them. And I think it's for a whole bunch of reasons. Number one, they like, when you look at ministers who do well in Tory poll ratings, it's ministers who are perceived to be doing something. So you can have your critique of Liz Truss's trade deals when she was International Development Secretary, but from the Tory member perspective, she was getting out and doing stuff. That's what they like. Ben Wallace, they like, because he's getting out and doing stuff with regards to Ukraine. Boris Johnson, I mean, he's not doing anything right now. He's just been on the back foot trying to respond to the Partygate scandal. So I think that's part of it. The second part of it is, in a weird way, they'll be very concerned about the ideological direction of where the party is going. That's the other thing you see in the Sunday papers today, that, you know, lots of MPs are saying, you know, Dan Hannan, the Lord Hannan, I should say, former Conservative MEP, you know, he's written a whole column in the Sunday Telegraph going on about, you know, where is this Conservative government? And if you're that kind of Jeremy Hunt, George Osborne traditional style of Tory, you look at this government, you're saying, okay, you've just spent £22 billion. You've got this whole row about whether you've misled Parliament. You're not very happy with the situation. That's why the ratings have tanked. And I think there will be a big push. You know, we've got Operation Big Dog, as it's called, the delightful name, to try and save the Prime Minister. But then there's also, I think there will no doubt be the 15th Operation Red Meat over the next month, where you can expect to see a whole load of kind of hardcore Conservative announcements to try and calm down those fears. That's why I think Tory members are not very happy at the moment. So if Boris Johnson wanted to fix that, he's going to do some more Conservative things. throw some red meat, and try and get on with some stuff, because Partygate's been going on, what, 6 months now, I guess, since Pippa Crerar started breaking those stories in December 2020. And it's kind of overshadowed the government's capacity to do anything. Every time a minister goes on TV, it's just Partygate, Partygate. So they're desperate to move on. But as we were saying earlier, it's not going to move on because we've still got this parliamentary investigation. And I guarantee you we'll still be talking about this in the autumn at party conference season.
So just quickly on just, I want to ask you about Labour actually, just finally before I let you go. But just in terms of, do you think, if you're a betting man, do you think Boris Johnson's going to survive and lead the Conservatives into the next election? We've obviously got the committee later in the year, so this isn't dead, as you said. And if not, if he doesn't, is Jeremy Hunt likely to win? I mean, he was obviously someone who supported Remain, but so did Liz Truss, and they've both reinvented themselves as Brexiteers. He's someone obviously more conventionally on the right economically. So yeah, will he survive? And if he didn't, hypothetically, what do you think about Jeremy Hunt's prospects?
I think it's more likely than not he survives. But it is interesting because when the Sue Gray report came out, everyone was like, it's quite muted. It's not going for the PM personally. It was going to be much worse. But then since then, the mood has definitely kind of soured amongst, I think, Tory MPs. And I think it's not just the 24 who publicly called for him to go, that Con Home poll. The feeling just is maybe a bit more damaging than I thought it would be. So the odds have short, but I'd say it's more likely than not at this stage because there's no obvious alternative. If there was a ready-made print across the water, because with Theresa May, if she went, you had Boris Johnson there. You also had Michael Gove there. Michael Gove, I think, will almost certainly not run for the leadership again next time. So there's not really a ready-made alternative. So I feel it's more likely than not. But the other thing we should say is, one that we've learned is Boris Johnson is quite a chaotic prime minister. You might put it in slightly harsher words than that. But Conservative MPs, one said to me, there's going to be another gate. We've had Wallpaper Gate, Partygate. There's going to be something else before the next election. And I think that sort of plays on the minds of some MPs as well, being like, in fact, actually, is there just going to be another scandal? And if that happens like this time next year, then that's really close to an election. Who's the next? Jeremy Hunt is doing the most organising. If you remember when Michael Portillo was running for the leadership in the early noughties, he was installing the telephone lines, was the famous phrase. I guess the equivalent now is WhatsApp groups. And there are so many of them, of outrider groups, of Tory MPs organising, and their critiques are also, if you look at what they say in public, they're clearly organised. There's clearly an operation going on there. But I would be very surprised if it's Jeremy Hunt because of that point about where the geographical gravity of the Tory party now is. I think they're much more likely to go from someone who is possibly even less tested than Jeremy Hunt, but has got a different appeal. And the one who I think is the most interesting out of all the potential contenders is Nadhim Zahawi, the Education Secretary. Because if you're a Tory activist, think about what he gives. He's got a businessman, successful founder of YouGov, obviously a multi-millionaire, which obviously Rishi Sunak brings complications in terms of his support, but backstory is very strong. Came for Saddam Hussein in the 1970s, came here with nothing, built up his political career gradually. He's seen as quite a reliable media performer. He's won plaudits from many people for the vaccine rollout. So I think he's the kind of person who could be very interesting. But my gut feeling is probably not going to be a contest this side of the next election.
Just finally, I'm interested in what the Tory perspective is on Labour's, I suppose, offering, or maybe like
what?
Well, this is what I was going to say. Yeah, so in fact, I'll just play a little clip shortly just to flesh that one out, because Labour's big stick for a while was the windfall tax, and I would say that they did pressure the Tories into doing windfall tax.
Definitely. I don't think it would have happened if Labour hadn't pressured.
But then the Tories did a more ambitious version, which is a bit embarrassing. But now, I suppose, Rachel Reeves was like, that shows we're winning the battle of ideas. But I think the problem with that is what do you say? What is the battle of ideas that's been waged by Labour there? Because are you saying that is the Labour, we do want a big active state because they're not making a coherent statement. So let's just hear what Annalise Dodds, who's the Labour Party chair and is in charge of the policy review for the Labour Party, said on Sky News.
Time. I mean, you're head of Labour's policy review that was launched in June 2021, so it's been running for a year now. We're currently facing an absolute cost of living crisis, inflation at a 40-year high, potentially the biggest drop in living standards since records began. What is the single transformative idea that you've come up with in this year-long policy review?
Well, we've come up with many ideas. If people are particularly interested, they can look at our reports on the Labour website. And I have to say,
I mean, it doesn't really grab the attention, does it, to say go to labourparty.org to try and find out exactly what we stand for in this day and age. It's a real problem for Labour because obviously, and I know you've written extensively about this, Owen, is that like Keir Starmer was elected on a particular platform, and that platform is being jettisoned. And it's actually been salami sliced bit by bit, that they've kind of moving away from where the party was in 2019 and 2020. But they've not quite got a vision of where they're going to, and they don't want to set up too much in advance, because if Labour had said, we're going to do a windfall tax the next election, the Tories do it. Oh, now what do we do? Well, you get clips sort of like sadly like that one you just had with Annalise Dodds there, where you can't really say anything. I think by the end of this year, if Labour doesn't really have some big ideas, and you can obviously criticise the Corbyn years for many things, but it had big ideas, very bold ideas that captured the imagination of, yourself and other many left-wing activists. At the moment, Keir Starmer's main pitch seems to be, we would be a more competent version of the guys who are there. We're going to still do the windfall tax. We're still spending this kind of money. Labour backed all the government's COVID policies. And fundamentally, Labour seems to back the government's levelling up agenda as well. So at the moment, I think that is a real challenge. And I think in some ways Labour wants to sit back and let the Tories eat themselves, which obviously they're doing quite a good job of at the moment in terms of letters and leadership contests. But if you look at, like you mentioned, James Johnson, you look at his focus groups on Times Radio, time and time again, the reason Labour is doing well is not because of Keir Starmer doing well, it's because of the Tories just being in a complete mess. And the thing Labour has to watch is if they suddenly come up, if the Tories sort of rebound, if they manage to draw a line under this and get to a better place, then I imagine Labour's polling lead will probably collapse relatively quickly, and it'll go back to where it was. And then people will be saying, well, we're going to lose the next election again. So I think the narrative could switch quite quickly. And for the Red Wall place I went to, what these people want is, and I think one of the most interesting things about where Labour could be is the politics of securitisation, which Claire Ainsley, who's Keir Starmer's chief of staff, has written about in her book, The New Working Class. That, those traditional community structures people had, trade unions, very strong employment rights, community facilities, a lot of those have gone over the past 40 years. And what Labour could replace that with is saying, we want to provide you economic security by dealing with 0 hours contracts and bad bosses. We could provide environmental security with dealing with climate change, national security in terms of being tough and draping themselves in the flag, which again, we know Keir Starmer likes to do. So there is like a potential narrative there that I think is interesting, but for whatever reason, at the moment, Labour just seems to want to just be sort of prodding the Tory bear than actually doing something itself.
Seb, I've taken so much of your time, which I'm very, very grateful for, but it's been absolutely fascinating, really, really thoughtful, and obviously full of actual insight. Sort of,
we try.
Well, exactly, and the efforts have been hugely rewarding. But Seb's book, which, as he's already mentioned, Broken Heartlands: A Journey Through Labour's Lost England. So the paperback version comes out on June the 23rd. Yeah, June the 23rd.
That's right. Yep. You should all rush out and get it. And there's a big new chapter which I spent in a month in Isha and Walton, Dom Rabsey, to look at the flip side of the kind of realignment of 2019. And is he in trouble there? And the answer is a resounding yes. But you have to buy the book to find out why.
The Lib Dems are yapping at his heels. We'll see.
Exactly.
Seb, honestly, it's been such an honour. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will speak to you soon.
Pleasure. Thanks, Owen.
See you soon. Great stuff. Really, really fascinating stuff. Don't go yet, by the way, because I'm going to just talk. We mentioned Labour there, and I suppose the issue about Labour's vision. Now, Keir Starmer. Let's just have a little look at what happened, or the kind of revelation, if you like, on Friday, which was Paul Waugh, who I'd say is someone who the Labour leadership are very favourable towards. He's not the eye. He said that Labour's likely to ditch Jeremy Corbyn's 2019 pledge to hike income tax on those earning more than £80,000. Party is looking at more creative ways of making the rich pay more. I should say that's not just 2019. I think 2019 manifesto obviously is associated now with an 80-seat Tory majority. I get that. It was also in the 2017 manifesto. Because the 2019 manifesto, I think a lot of people even, I think, around Jeremy Corbyn believed that manifesto was just excessively policy heavy because the Labour leadership were desperately at the time trying to shift the conversation away from Brexit, which they succeeded in doing in 2017. But by 2019, the country was so polarised it just wasn't a runner at all. But anyway, that's why they threw so many policies at it. So it's even amongst many people around Corbyn's team, they kind of think, well, the 2019 manifesto had a lot. It was noisy. The 2017 manifesto, on the other hand, was described by Keir Starmer as the foundational document of the Labour Party in the leadership contest. In fact, let's just be very clear, because Keir Starmer's going back on this commitment to income taxes. Forget about the 2019 manifesto. It was in his leadership campaign. So it was pledge number 1. He did 10 pledges. Now, I think some people don't understand. I don't want to be patronising here, but I think some of Keir Starmer's most militant supporters don't understand what pledge means. The definition of pledge is a solemn promise or undertaking. Pledge number 1, economic justice. Increase income tax for the top 5% of earners, reverse the Tories' cuts in corporation tax, and clamp down on tax avoidance, particularly of large corporations. No stepping back from our core principles. His tweets still up about it. Keir Starmer in the leadership campaign. Increase income tax for the top 5% of earners, reverse the Tories' cuts in corporation tax, and clamp down on tax avoidance, particularly of large corporations. No stepping back from our core principles. Well, you see, the thing is, what he's done there is made a series of pledges, cast iron commitments. And in fact, I'll just be clear, during the leadership contest, I didn't vote for Keir Starmer, but nonetheless, for example, I remember this whole, when he made this commitment, and I was interested to know, is this definitely for real? No chance of any U-turn. And one of Keir Starmer's advisors rang me and said, this is absolutely cast iron, 100% income tax going up for the top 5% of earners. Absolutely. I mean, not engraved in the stone, because Ed Miliband did that and it didn't go down well, Ed Stone. So it was a solemn commitment. Now, here's the thing. Now, I raised this when I mentioned this on Twitter, because Keir Starmer's leadership campaign was the most dishonest in British democratic history. Now, people say, oh, what about Boris Johnson? He's a liar. Boris Johnson lies as easily as he breathes. I mean, I don't think anyone disputes that deception and dishonesty is absolutely woven into the fundamental character and person of Boris Johnson. And I think their dishonesty is kind of different, because Boris Johnson has this kind of self-serving, how am I going to get myself out of this one kind of dishonesty. Like, he was sacked by his party leader for lying about an affair, for example, that kind of thing. I don't think anyone could look back at Boris Johnson's leadership campaign and say it was dishonest. Like, if he was as dishonest as leadership campaign as Keir Starmer, we'd now be rejoining the European Union. Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, his whole shtick in the leadership election was, get Brexit done. They got their hard Brexit done, which I think is actually a very damaging Brexit deal for the country. I mean, the fundamental, you could say the one promise they did break was not to hike national insurance. So they did break that. That was a general election commitment. The overall, in general, they've just stuck to what they said they were going to do, which is not, in my opinion, good for the country or good for millions of people. Keir Starmer made all these pledges, including pledge number 1, increase income tax on the top 5%, which they're now planning to abandon. Things like party unity and let's not even bother indulging that one. I just think the issue is, and I've said this before, and I'm going to stick by it, that kind of dishonesty, that wanton dishonesty, brazen dishonesty, it corrodes democracy. Because what happens is, if politicians keep saying things which they promise to do, and then they don't do them, and actually they just do the opposite. If you can't trust a politician to do what they say, then why would you engage in the democratic process? I mean, democracy just becomes a potluck. You can vote for someone, you have literally no idea what they're going to do. They just make a promise and then they just do something completely different. And if you knock on doors, I've knocked on thousands of doors in my life. One of the most cliched things voters say is, "Oh, politicians say one thing and they do another. Politicians lie." And it is actually, it's bad for the left, that, because if you want in politics, kind of bold ideas, and if you want them to exist in politics, if voters don't have faith in politicians to deliver or abide by their promises, then the bigger the promise, the more cynical they're likely to be, aren't they? So it's actually really, it's bad for democracy. It's bad for the left. Now, I get yelled at a lot by Starmer supporters, and I'm going to distinguish between them, because there are just Starmer supporters who think, look, okay, I know he's not perfect, but he's the Labour leader. We need to get rid of the Tories. I get all that. I'm a Labour voter. I've voted Labour all my life. Some people find that ridiculous, but that's who I am. I'm a Labour sort of guy. There are others who are just cult-like in their attitude. They just literally just go over on Twitter and behave in the way that Corbyn supporters were always caricatured as, and there were like front page news stories about abuse from the Tories. They just send just prolific abuse. I'm not doing this as a violin, by the way. It's the double standards that annoy me, not being yelled at by, essentially, it's like being savaged by a Waitrose queue in Tunbridge Wells when the organic chutneys run out. I've said that before, and someone pointed out there isn't a proper Waitrose in Tunbridge Wells, but you get the gist. But they get F off and join the Tories. I get all that, which is what Corbyn supporters are always accused of. If you don't care, if you only go on about Boris Johnson's dishonesty and you ignore Keir Starmer's dishonesty, you don't care about dishonesty. You just don't. You care about dishonesty if you're the victim of it. You care about dishonesty if it's a politician you don't like, if it's a politician you don't support. But if it's your guy being dishonest, you don't care. The means, the ends justifies the means. Anything goes. He can lie through his back teeth. And look, the reality is, the reason that a big song and dance isn't made about this is the victims of Keir Starmer's dishonesty were people on the left and ordinary Labour Party members. And they're not regarded as legitimate political actors. It's seen as a good thing to dupe the left, to do anything you can to marginalise and ostracize the left and to defeat the left. So as far as the newspapers are concerned, media outlets in this country, generally, their view is, be as dishonest as you like, if the left are on the receiving end, obviously, they're not legitimate political actors. We want them to be defeated. And if Keir Starmer wants to do that, then good. Richard Tice, the Brexit Party leader, or Reform Party, whatever they're called now, when he said, there was Keir Starmer was one on the leadership, one of their big purges and attacks on the left, he was like, great, good. Keir Starmer's doing a good thing. The left needs to be marginalised in British politics. Great to have the Brexit Party cheering you on as you take on the left. It is astonishing how this political heist has been able to unfold. Because, as I've said, no leadership campaign in modern democratic history has been so dishonest. Blair's leadership pitch wasn't dishonest. He didn't say he was going to get rid of Clause 4, which is what he did. But you'd have to be pretty thick, I'm afraid, to have voted for Tony Blair and not realise the exact political direction he was going to embark on. He made that clear in the leadership election in 1994. It wasn't dishonest. Whatever people think about Jeremy Corbyn, you can talk about his faults all you like. Obviously, he abided by his leadership election commitments. This guy has done the exact opposite. And it is, as I've said, it's just very, very, very bad for democracy. So people go, oh, you attack it. Oh, you're just helping the Tories. Why do you join the Tories, Owen? Well, I'm not going to join the Tories because I'm a lifelong democratic socialist. And I when it comes to, it's not many Tories attacking Keir Starmer for not wanting to tax the rich. I mean, it's Keir Starmer shifting towards the Conservative position. That's what I'm objecting to. I'm objecting to the lack of a clear offer which is distinct from that of the Conservatives. That's my problem with what Labour are going for. Instead, they made their dividing lines honesty, which is hilarious because obviously Keir Starmer is serially dishonest but knows he can get away with it because the media don't care about lying through your back teeth to Labour Party members on the left. And, again, I am an independent political commentator and my job is to just say what I think. And I'm not a press officer for the Labour Party. I don't work for the Labour Party. I have to just say what I actually think. And what I think is a very inarguable fact, which is Labour's current leader said one thing to get elected as leader of the party and has done something completely different. And if your view is, well, politics as a football team, so I'll just blindly get out my pom-pom balls and cheer on whoever is Labour leader, as long as he's generally kind of my brand of politics, because I think often the brand of kind of centrist he supports Keir Starmer, it's not substance for them that matters. Politics is a vibe. It's a general gist. They don't really care about policies. They want what they most object to with Boris Johnson is that they see him as indecent and embarrassing and uncouth, and they just want this kind of mythical age of politics where things are kind of nice and stable and not embarrassing to come back. That was what a lot of Joe Biden supporters wanted, incidentally. Politics to become boring, rather than just, oh no, Trump's done another tirade on Twitter and, all that kind of stuff. Well, politics has not become boring in the United States. Far from it. It's a very polarized and divided nation. And Joe Biden is doing, I'm afraid, very badly in the polling, particularly, it has to be said, amongst younger people. So if that's people's solution, then I just think, look over the Atlantic. I want the Tories out. I think it's difficult to emphasize my almost the contempt for the Tories woven into my DNA. But if you think that it is in any way justifiable to ignore this serial dishonesty, even if you support Keir Starmer's direction and say nothing about it, I think that's fine. Then, as I've said, you don't care about honesty in politics. You don't care about integrity in politics. And fundamentally, you don't care about democracy. Now, the final thing I want to talk about, these are often two things I end with because this is the burning skip that we currently live in. Now, the Labour MP, Stella Creasy. Now, I'm going to talk about this just briefly because it's just so grim and gruesome. Stella Creasy is a Labour MP who doesn't have my politics generally, I have to say. She comes from what I would say is the kind of the right of the Labour Party in lots of ways. I mean, she probably wouldn't like me saying that, but I think that's still justifiable. She was interviewed for the Telegraph, and she was interviewed about her experiences where she was threatened with gang rape at university. So this is how the interview went. We are here to talk about a horrific experience when she was threatened with gang rape at university. But as with all conversations with politicians these days, particularly Labour politicians, any discussion about women quickly turns to their struggle to define the term in the first place. Well, sorry, who made the discussion go that way? I don't think that was Stella Creasy, was it? It wasn't, was it? Camilla, who wrote this article, this interview. Many of her colleagues have notably declined to even try. Surely as a fellow feminist, she and J.K. Rowling aren't too far apart on the issue. No, I don't agree with her, and I'm told I'm a bad feminist because I take a different view, she reveals. Now, what on earth is a interview which is about a woman who talking about how she was threatened with gang rape at university? It's been segued again into let's make this all about trans people, one of the most marginalized, besieged minorities in Britain. And it was written in the interview in a way of kind of like, oh, it just, well, as these discussions often do, because the interviewer decided to make it about trans people, fine. Now, what happened there is trans people, obviously, we have a whole kind of focus again on trans people getting piled on Twitter. But Stella Creasy got piled in on Twitter, on social media, all day. So she does an interview about being threatened with gang rape at university. And then the interview is made to focus on trans people again. And then she gets piled on Twitter by people who say, we're defending women by piling on a woman for daring to support trans people. She shared some of the emails, trans women that she got off the back of it. Trans women are not females and never will be. You stupid, the C word, which I'm not going to say for obvious reasons. Another one, what she say, you, my dear, will burn in hell. Now, we often have this debate talking about how abusive supporters of trans rights are. Now, the late Dawn Foster spoke about her own, how she was threatened with rape. She got threatened. She got rape threats. This was covered at the time. Pink News covered it. Obviously, I knew Dawn. I was friends with her. She died last year. She was a very passionate supporter of trans rights as a cis woman. Natasha Devon, an LBC journalist who also supports trans rights, she wrote, as someone who supports trans rights. She said she'd been threatened with rape threats as well. Now, I think we need a conversation at some point about how often it's actually cis women who the polling shows support trans rights more than men by a big margin, by the way. Every poll shows that. They're the ones often being hounded on Twitter. Yeah, sure, cis gay men and bisexual men, who stand by our trans siblings, people in our own space, our own community. That also happens to us. But actually, it's often, and I'm not trying to distract here from, obviously, trans people get the worst and most severe and horrific abuse. But it's striking that those who say, we're defending women, women are being silenced, then pile on any woman with the temerity to support trans rights and to support trans people. I think it's absolutely astonishing. You've got this from Dawn Foster here. Journalist Dawn Foster threatened with rape simply for being a trans ally, showing how vile transphobes truly are. Now, in Australia, we've just had this election in which the right-wing party lost, their Tories. Now, they actually used in that election, they went in on trans rights in the way that we're seeing the Tories and their allies currently trying to do at the moment. But actually, it didn't work for them. I mean, here's an article, here's a headline here. Coalition lost. Coalition, of course, being the right in Australia. The transphobe thing was an absolute disaster. So it actually didn't work for them. They went in hard trying to monster and demonize trans people in an effort to hammer the Conservatives. To hammer the Labour Party in Australia. I mean, again, this is just such a dark moment and era for trans people who obviously suffer huge amounts of abuse. Hate crimes towards trans people quadrupled in a few years. In terms of things like the polling shows being scared to use a toilet, in terms of being physically or verbally abused at work, in schools, in universities. I mean, it gets even worse because in that whole atmosphere, the Conservatives are doing everything they can to fight a so-called culture war, which is essentially stigmatizing minorities and tapping into bigotry about perceived minorities. So Suella Braverman, who is the Attorney General, did a whole interview about how schools shouldn't affirm trans people, young trans people in schools, and should encourage them, and teachers and so on should not kowtow to them in terms of using their preferred pronouns or letting them use the toilets which actually meet the gender they identify with. I mean, this is what we're heading towards, clearly, is Section 28. Section 28 was introduced in the 1980s during the then moral panic about gay people. The idea then was that gay people tended to disproportionately be sexual predators who preyed on children and wanted to brainwash children. They wanted to kind of, exploit vulnerable young people and turn them gay. And that's why the so-called promotion of homosexuality was banned in schools. That's what Section 28 did, because it was kowtowing to that whole moral panic. The idea that people turn gay because they're told to be gay, which is obviously ludicrous because why are people like me gay growing up in a straight society where the norm is to be straight? Now, this is, I think, a really important point because obviously the right have embraced this and they're going for this hard. They're using trans rights and the stigma attached to trans people in order to cause chaos for the Labour Party and anyone who's generally left of centre. That's what they're trying to do. That's what they did that's why they went for gay people in the 1980s. They knew at the time, actually, social attitudes towards gay people were way worse than they are towards trans people today. The polling does not show massive hostility to trans people. The polling did show massive hostility towards gay people, I'm afraid to say, in the 1980s. By 1987, only 11% of people said that same-sex relations were always fine. It's a tiny minority. Things changed quite dramatically. But nonetheless, that's what they're trying to do. But there are those who call themselves progressives and feminists, who are not representative of progressives and feminists, who have paved the foundations for a moral panic which threatens to consume the country in almost hysteria and lay the foundations for a new Section 28 and to make life completely intolerable to trans people. And to those people, I say, shame, shame, shame on you. How dare you? How do you not have any shame or any sense of what you've done to some of those stigmatized people in the country? Every day, my direct messages full of messages from trans people, many of them people who are younger trans people who are scared, who are terrified, who don't think they have a future in this country because every day they open social media or they see the papers or they see these newspapers or they see these media interviews with gotchas about genitalia. I mean, what on earth is happening to this country where we have these national debates about people's genitals on broadcast interviews? And they see all that and they feel scared and upset and distressed. And the consequences of that are absolutely horrifying. And I just think people have to realize that the lack of humanity, and don't say this is about protecting women when you're hounding women like Stella Creasy on social media. And, all those women politicians like Angela Rayner or Dawn Butler, commentators, people like Ash Sarkar or Ellie Mae O'Hagan, the late Dawn Foster, Natasha Devon, women who stand up and support trans people, and they're the ones who are often the most monstered and the most attacked, protecting women and speaking up for women as if, when often the primary victims of this abuse and this hounding, where women are piled in on social media for supporting a minority in an effort to intimidate others into not speaking out in support of trans people. Just want to end on that. Thanks for everyone for watching. Enjoyed that. It was great to have. We often have people, obviously, left and centre commentators, but I think it's very important to have commentators who know the lay of the land in the Conservatives. So it's great to have Seb Payne on as well. We covered a huge amount. I hope everyone is well. We've got lots of interviews coming up in the week. So watch out for the interviews we've got ahead. And if you sign up on patreon.com/OwenJones84, you can support the channel and suggest interviews. You keep us going. It's obviously not me doing this channel by myself. That would be ridiculous. I can barely tie my shoelaces. So you keep this running. We're not run by billionaires. We're supported by you. Thank you to David Barretter and to Tad Campwell for your support on Super Chat during the show as well. Before you go, make sure you press like. Press like. Stop now. Just stop. Press like on YouTube. Click it. If you're not watching on YouTube, click the YouTube link. Press like and press subscribe to support the show. And thank you to Woody Woodpecker. Always good to have Woody Woodpecker with us. Thank you, everybody. I hope you're doing well, and I will speak to you soon. Lots of love.